Wow, well, it's great to meet you all. As Sarah said, I teach actually in the English department, although I'm pretty intellectually promiscuous, or I try to be as much as I can. And, but I will say that the main source of my reflection and my research about objects comes from the objects themselves, but also from texts and from books. And I'm so excited to talk with you and stage this conversation today with many of you who are artists and who are working through a different kind of epistemology. And I'm really hoping that we can compare notes and come up together with some new ideas about what skeuomorphs are and what they aren't, and also how they can help us access the past or access the future or think about the difference in medium. So what I want to do today is just talk a little bit about these definitions. I'm not going to read through them, but I thought at least you would have a little bit of a souvenir to take home with some quotations and theories of skeuomorphism that I find particularly exciting and beautiful. The last one here, The Annihilation of the Useful by the Beautiful, is by a 19th century art critic who did not actually use the term skeuomorphism, but described the effect that skeuomorphs produce. So skeuomorph comes from the Greek, skeo or skeuo. What do you guys say, skeo or skeuo? I've heard it both ways. Skeo, skeuo. I like it when you say it, Beth.
I kind of try to imitate you. Which is very, you know, it's right in there with the entire definition.
We'll try to say it really quickly.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So skeuomorphs, the first term skeo, comes from vessel or implement, and the second one, morph, meaning form. And so it's very much a form about implements, which I think is an interesting way to think. And the way I'm particularly interested in thinking about it is not the only way to think about it, but I'm interested in thinking about skeuomorphs as objects that bear a resemblance to an obsolete or old-fashioned or bygone form of technology. You know, I think that I'll be talking a little bit about digital design and our wonderful products, but you know, I think a very easy skeuomorph to identify is this one right here. You hear the sound of the shutter? There is no shutter on this digital camera, and yet the sound of the shutter click tells us that the photo is being taken. And so I think that that sound itself is a skeuomorph. It is you know, a digital process that is sort of signaling to us, oh, you're taking a picture because, and you know this because it sounds like the kind of picture you would have taken in 1990 or 1940 or whenever else. And so that's a skeuomorph, and that's sort of how I'm thinking about it. Again, and I'm really interested in the way that skeuomorphs transmit a kind of anxiety about technological change, or even a nostalgia for forms of the past, possibly, or a disdain for forms of the past, right? Because skeuomorphs are kind of nostalgic for and carry a trace of things that happened in the past, but they also obviate those things. Like thanks to this, like this kind of technology obviated and made obsolete a shutter and a camera. So I guess that from the point of view of you know, the ivory tower in the English department, I'm thinking about, you know, artistic labor, and I'm really excited to talk to you about who are laboring in art and at art about skeuomorphs, because I think that skeuomorphs, in fact, at least in the examples that I've been really thinking through in my own research, register a kind of anxiety about labor and anxiety about work, what work is, and what kinds of tools we use for the work that we do. So these are the kind of the broader theoretical questions that I've been thinking through. You guys familiar with the mid-20th century French anthropologist Claude Lévi-Strauss? He wrote a book, I think it's translated as Totemism, about totem animals, and he says this widely misquoted thing about how, you know, animals are chosen as totems and, you know, across cultures, not because they are, quote, good to eat, but because they are good to think. And so you often hear him sort of quoted as saying animals are good to think with. And I like that formulation because I think skeuomorphs and skeuomorphism is good to think with, and hopefully we can do some of that thinking today. So one of the examples that I thought we could talk about, I just wanted to sort of bring up, is the Liechtenstein, the Ben-Day dots. You guys are familiar with Ben-Day dots, with this sort of printing technology that Liechtenstein is recreating on his own with a paint and a soft brush. You know, he's actually doing the labor that a machine-driven press and a percussive plate, you know, pressing onto a piece of paper would do, but he's doing that work of that hard percussive printing plate with a soft paintbrush and with paint. And I think there's a way in which he's in some ways resisting the mechanization of labor by taking that labor back into his own body and doing that kind of labor. And I walked by this yesterday in the galleries at the Milwaukee Art Museum, and it seemed evocative to me of a kind of nostalgia for the past, or a kind of reclamation of that labor back into the body that Lichtenstein's hand-painted Ben-Day dots represent. And I think of these, for example, as skeuomorphs. And my own research, I'm really preoccupied by Moby Dick. I'm an English professor, right? Have you guys read Moby Dick? I'm not going to make you read it today, I promise. But Moby Dick, I think, is a really, really interesting text to think about in the context of skeuomorphs and of skeuomorphism, because it is about a very obsolete, very archaic industry, whaling, which in the 19th century was the source for us of the oil that we used for lighting and for machine lubrication. It's what we used before we began really widely extracting petroleum. And so I think it's a very interesting thing to think about as a kind of archaic energy industry. And Rockwell Kent is an artist who I think is practicing skeuomorphism in a really, really interesting way. And he made these very famous at the time illustrations of Moby Dick, which were published in 1930 by Lakeside Press, which is an imprint of R.R. Donnelly and Company in Chicago. They produced these gorgeous, this is actually from the Lakeside Press edition, these gorgeous illustrated editions of American classics in the 1930s, when the whole notion of American literature was brand new. No one thought that America had real artistic tradition worth writing home about until around the 19-teens, 1920s, and 1930s. And so Lakeside got in on this fad for American literature and American classics by reproducing a lot of these 19th century works, including Moby Dick, and they hired Rockwell Kent. Rockwell Kent, as some of you might know, was a really interesting artist. He was a painter, a printmaker, a wood engraver, and he was also a real adventurer. He's the kind of person who would show up in the news about the people about town. He took all these adventurous sailing trips to Greenland, and he crashed several ships, and he tried to sail in a tiny wooden boat around the through the Straits of Magellan, and he went to Alaska with his 9-year-old son for a year to live in a one-room log cabin that he built. And he's a very adventurous, he had a very, very active romantic life, lots of partners, many at the same time, very, very kind of sort of a real artistic celebrity. And he was very outspoken about his politics. He was an outspoken socialist. He was a president of these communist organizations. He was hauled before Joe McCarthy's Committee on American Activities and had to sort of testify about his participation in these communist organizations. And at those hearings, the story goes that he actually distributed flyers to everyone saying, yes, in fact, there is a force abroad in the country that is promoting anti-Americanism. It is here in this committee. It is headed by Joe McCarthy. And anyway, so he's an interesting guy to think about labor because he is such an outspoken leftist. And he is representing this very obsolete but celebrated labor in the early 20th century. People were not horrified by whaling in the same way that I am right now, sort of mass slaughter of whales, but they were sort of thinking of this as like a great early American industry and something to look back to with a lot of pride. So what interests me in this context of skeuomorphism about Rockwell Kent are his illustrations. And I'll just show you a few of them. This is, I think, a really wonderful, it's a representation of Ahab looking down from the side of the ship into the water, and you see his face is sort of cut up by the waves. You see this sort of, the work of sailing and these collectives of laborers represented very lovingly. This is Ishmael over here, sort of setting out for Nantucket. And here's Ishmael in bed with Queequeg very early on in the book, the harpooner who became his bosom friend. And here we see one of the harpooneers actually in this, I think, very majestic pose, getting ready to harpoon the whale. You get this sort of, this very heroic depiction of labor that's perfectly under control, perfectly symmetrical, perfectly graceful. It's almost a sort of picture of ease and grace in this moment just before this extreme violence. And I think that what most people, and this is Ahab, of course, with his ivory leg, getting ready to get the troops on the crew together to go after the white whale that he's seeking vengeance against. And these illustrations, and this is Moby Dick himself. It's a very strange image, but this is actually a sperm whale, which has a very narrow bottom jaw coming straight at the viewer of the image. And you see that, again, these sort of tiny laborers at the top, their labor always part of the picture. And these images look like wood engravings, right? Like they look very, very much like wood engravings, and they're often called wood engravings in catalogs and other kinds of images, but they are not wood engravings. It says, 1930, Rockwell Kent did not need to make wood engravings in order to illustrate Moby Dick in this style. And so he didn't. He made line drawings and pen and ink in the style of wood engravings. And this is sort of where I started thinking about skeuomorphism, was thinking, why did he do this? What were the kind of pressures that were on him, the interest that he had? What was it about the wood engraving aesthetic that really appealed to him in this moment? And to me, I think a wood engraving to Kent, based on a lot of his writing, meant a kind of honorable, physical, manual, authentic labor. It looked like carpentry. John Ruskin called wood engraving a form of plowing. You're sort of taking your plowshare, which is the engraving tool, across this line of wood. And I think that Rockwell Kent, as this kind of leftist figure who really glorified labor and really believed in labor, really wanted to transmit the authenticity that went with that kind of labor. But he didn't have to. He didn't have to in the 1930s. And I think that here's an example of some wood engravings he did produce. These beautifully homoerotic images of these gorgeous nude men on wooden sailing boats. These were widely reprinted in magazines and newspapers and in print sort of advertising campaigns for a company called the American Car and Foundry Company, which made parts for cars. And in the 1920s, they got into the business of making motorized yachts. And they needed to get their name out and associate it with everything that was yachty and boaty and maritime. And so they hired Rockwell Kent, who's this debonair sailor, adventurer, and he created these wood engravings. And I think that the source of Rockwell Kent's wealth, the way that he made his living as an artist, was through commercial commissions like this. And I think that he had some anxiety about that. I know he had some anxiety about that. He dismissed that type of work. He said that New York City, where all the publishers and advertisers were, was the gold camp. And he would go to the gold camp and set up shop and do a whole lot of art and then leave. And eventually, a contemporary critic and another wood engraver, Claire Leighton, said about Rockwell Kent that he didn't have to do wood engraving anymore, and he couldn't actually complete all the commissions that he had if he engraved every image. And so he started doing things in the woodcut style and pen and ink. And so I think in some ways, for me, Rockwell Kent's skeuomorphism represents both a nostalgia for this noble plowing labor and its abandonment at the same time. Like he abandons it, and there's a kind of double-faced, Janus-faced aspect to his woodcut style engravings. Here's some more woodcuts that he made, some wood engravings he made as colophons for book publishers. And his style became very associated with bookishness in American classics in the early 20th century, in part because he created these images and these brands for these presses that have this woodcut style, and a lot of them endure today. You should check in the beginning of your paperbacks how many images look like Kent engravings, and you'll find that a lot of them do. So I also just wanted to show a few images before we before I hand the reins over to Beth and we open things up for conversation. Your phone and your digital devices are really a major archive of skeuomorphs. And I did a little bit of research into Apple design specifically, not as a particular member of the Apple cult, but because I think Steve Jobs very explicitly implanted skeuomorphs into the design of his early products. It was really his intention to teach people how to use digital environments and how to navigate digital environments by embedding signs of the material analog world in them. Of course, the material analog world of desks and workplaces as a place that's sort of being replaced and changed and really morphed by digital technology. So these are old Apple designs. You guys may recognize this. The leather-bound calendar stitched together with thread, with that little scrap of paper from where you sort of imperfectly tore off the last month's calendar. That's very skeuomorphic. The wood in the icon of the book itself, a kind of obsolete form in a digital world. The green felt that would be lighting the game center, almost like a billiards table. And in 2013, under the direction of the new Chief Design Officer, Johnny Ive, Apple started moving away explicitly from skeuomorph, saying that, quote, "it's time to take the training wheels off." Like, we have trained our users to understand how to navigate the digital environment through these skeuomorphs, and now we're going to move away into something, quote unquote, cleaner or flatter. Johnny Ive is really interested in the Bauhaus school and in modernist design, the idea of form following function and cleanness and clearness and the entire aesthetic that he calls flat design. And after the release of iOS 7, he was saying that he was moving Apple explicitly away from skeuomorphism, except that very recently they've been moving right back towards skeuomorphism, perhaps more explicitly than they ever had before in these watches. And I just thought I would end with this image of the Apple Watch because in some ways, to me at least, the kind of skeuomorphs that I'm interested in represent anxiety about how we spend our time and like how we split our time between labor and leisure and how we make our living versus the kind of work that gives us life. And I think that in some ways all those anxieties are wrapped up in this weird skeuomorph. So should I turn it over to you?
Sure.
And then we can.
Sure.
All right.
Yeah.
Do you want me to do your slides or? Yeah, I can do that.
Okay.
I'll be happy to.
So I'm going to do something a little bit more just, like just a summary of just provocative images that we can talk about briefly so that we can get into conversation, because I know that I'm actually going to learn a lot from all of you.
Absolutely.
Probably more than just hearing myself talk, actually, or learn from both of you. But I just kind of pulled some, there's a gabillion examples, right, of this particular topic. I mean, you really, and so I was like, well, I'll kind of like, we'll go into contemporary art. I'll just like kind of dip in and have some key moments that may or may not be, a place to provoke and begin the dialogue. So if you wanna. So I don't know, you think this is a skeuomorph or not? I mean, it's not, so this is like, I have to say, I diverge from you a little bit because while I labor a lot in my own practice, I actually was more intrigued with this idea of authenticity or original object in translation. So yes, the labor's there, or the reduction of labor. So it's like, is this Duchamp fountain actually an example of skeuomorph or not? Because it was manufactured, it still is the original. It is authentic, it's an authentic object, but then I think through semantics and context, it becomes a skeuomorph. So, and I'm like, welcome to being proven wrong to that, but I just thought, okay, this is a different way of thinking about this way of and for me, it's not like the skeuomorph is actually not it's not a manifestation of anxiety in some ways. It's a placating of anxiety for me. Like if I have a hook that I know, like this was a urinal, it's still a urinal, but now I'm being asked to consider it as a work of art or it's beautiful. And I mean, this is like, a gabillion years ago that this happened, but I think it still influences many of us every day in our own practice. I think that all of this is kind of a salve in some ways, a way of placating, of hooking, not only a layman, but our own community in dialogue and ways of kind of subverting context. So, and beginning dialogue in that way. So industrial made, the physical act of turning it on its side, signing your name, and then done, skeuomorph, in my opinion, in some ways. So if we can go on from this, Merritt Oppenheim, pretty obvious, like recognize tool, function, the breakfast in fur, kind of monumental work, but once again made or removed from its original utility or its reference to decoration, even as a decorative object or a decorative tea set, and made into a work of art, obviously. So, and we could segue right into a huge conversation about surrealism, I think, also, and how they use this kind of idea to kind of hook and subvert and change through mimesis. So, continuing on, somewhat closer to our time frame, I think Oldenburg and Vanbergen are really interesting because they are, I kind of, and I'd be curious to know what you think about this, but it's like, of course, something that you know about through art history. You see it's common, it's everyday, somewhat camp and kitsch at the same time. And yet I've recently become more obsessed again with Oldenburg and Vanbergen because I think what they do, this idea of being both monumental and also anthropomorphic at the same time, is brilliant and also falls neatly into this definition. And I mean, there's the manufacturing labor of the industrial object, which they always started primarily, with the exception of a few cherries here and there, with an industrially made object, and then this kind of atelier that needs to come together to make these monumental forms that become permanent in the environment. Okay, next. Just wanted to give a shout out to On Function, awesome exhibition. Myra Mimlich Gray in the house, conflations. I love the way she uses this premise of like a found object, an authentic object, as we know. I mean, this is like, I think, a very, in some ways, it's a common way of subverting and thinking about skeuomorphs now, especially in craft practice. Like, I do it as well in my own work, and I relate to it. I find it provocative and comfortable, weirdly, at the same time. I don't know how you feel about it, but I love this, like, just enough information of something that's recognized and representative before it goes into la la land, some weird, subversive, physical manifestation of something else. Brilliant. And next. And then Alan Wexler. This, I think, really relates to Duchamp in a lot of ways. So once again, updated, just taking this authentic, original industrial object, renaming it, redefining what the use is for, turning it on its end, and having it become a beautiful object. And just because you asked,
I demanded.
Yeah, this is an example of my work. So I use skeuomorphs in my work all the time. I wasn't actually thinking about them as skeuomorphs, but just this understanding of starting with the premise of what is known, not necessarily something that's antiquated, but now. And the thing that we talked about before, which was so fascinating, especially with Natalie, was just, what everything is antiquated starting now. Even like, it's ironic that they're like Bauhaus, flat design, like that is totally in the past, So I think when you start thinking about what do skeuomorphs look like in the future, what's going to define, like, where is the bar going to change and shift? Where's the standard, the scale going to slide to in order for us to be comfortable with objects or ideas, 100 years from now, if we're around 1,000 years from now, like, what are we going to need to feel okay to be able to relate to whatever objects are then? So I mean, for me, these are very kind of symbolic. It's a piece about time, Crib and Cradle. The doors on the left are actually closed, but the viewer would walk through those doors, go past the crib, and kind of confront this shaker adult cradle. So, just like kind of using just appropriation within limits where I feel comfortable, to kind of talk about larger issues of human condition and parallels in different places in history and things like that. But I'm interested in, I love that you started with Rockwell Kent and you moved to Mac in some ways, because, I mean, and a lot of times people ask me, why don't you put technology in your still lives? I'm like, I can't do that. Like, it's even more dated immediately than a goblet or a drinking vessel, So I'm looking for a universal where there is no universal now. We're living in such an age where things are shifting and changing and moving so fast that I think it's like vertigo when we're talking about the definition of skeuomorphs. It's like you could be nostalgic about everything in some ways. Those are kind of the thoughts that I would like to just share before we get into a larger dialogue. Can you add to that, Sarah?
No. What I would love to do is I would love to hear what this has made some of you think about, or what questions you might have. Is skeuomorph a term that you use in your work? Is it something that, the way that Beth and Jamie have framed it today, is it something that makes you think differently about either work you do, work that you teach, questions of certain processes or practices that you're engaged in?
I just want to start as a prior instructor of metals. We teach techniques and processes that are thousands of years old, and they're basically obsolete by terms of technology. So for so many people, their work becomes conceptual purely by the fact that there's no room for it to be functional anymore. So it's an immediate displacement into considering the material meaning or the conceptual meaning or the cultural meaning embedded in objects, which is material culture, and why it's so interesting. So that's like, it happens before you even know you're teaching it. I mean, jewelry exists functionally, but especially in the field of hollowware, other than discussing the name of the company that still creates flat bar stock into hand-forged silverware.
Oldenburg crafters.
Yeah, I mean, it exists on the margins, but for like less than the 1%ers, I think. So as a craft artist, I think it's almost inevitable that you're going to be dealing with this material. Although I don't know how it's useful to apply skeuomorphs to the urinal. I can't get around that. I mean, how does that further our understanding of a critical stance in art? Because to me, it's all about comfort of technology. It's like, this is a new technology, I'm not comfortable, but I'm going to apply it to an old form that I'm familiar and intimate with, I have a physical relationship. So I'm curious about that.
I was curious about it as well, and to be honest, I wasn't 100% about it, but I thought that it would be provocative to the discussion because it is essentially a removal from its original intent and function, and it acted as a catalyst for every contemporary artist since that moment when he did that, and even before that when he hung the shovel from the ceiling.
I still feel like it was about function, and criticality,
Or its subversion.
Well, it is still functional as a work of art. So that's where I think we can get into craft and labor, which is one aspect of it. But I think I think it's just a matter of whether you define art as functional or not also. And I think that's a good conversation to have as well, maybe slightly off topic.
So riff off the phenomena, I wonder where Sherry Levine's
Exactly.
1981 cast bronze replica.
Yeah.
Where does that fit?
Yeah.
And conceptualism, photographers like Richard Prince,
Exactly.
And then also Robert Gober, I think,
Exactly.
those fountains, that direct lineage from the fountains, if they are original fountains.
Well, and I think that the definition, something that I find so funny about this definition from the Oxford English Dictionary is that it splits. On the one hand, a skeuomorph is something that preserves a kind of obsolete technology. On the other hand, it's just something that looks like it's made in another medium, And so I think that I like how slippery, I think the slipperiness of the term makes it generative and interesting. And I'm not sure, is everything in this room, in the Chipstone collection, a skeuomorph because it's been removed from a certain kind of domestic function and put into a museum environment, and it serves the function of what? Beauty, teaching us about the past?
I think that's the same conversation I was thinking about with Duchamp. I'm like, is this something that can be applied in some ways? Because I do think that was kind of the genesis for me in contemporary art in terms of beginning to explore these definitions. Maybe it wasn't that one object, but it was that premise of removal and and then okay, so then these are all also authentic objects, so then you're dealing with those parallels as well. It's funny, this is a little bit of a tangent, but I've been going through my mother's magazines from the 80s, these American home, traditional home, and they're all, I didn't realize this because I was a child in the 80s and I thought this was the way it was. But there was some huge revival in colonial American aesthetic where everyone was like, and you can have this completely perfect period room with, shaker boxes and the 70s, 80s, and I was like, wow, this is a whole where's that coming from? Where people in the 80s, the 70s and 80s want their homes to look like they're colonial Americans.
Soviet Union. Sorry.
Well,
Bicentennial.
yeah, a little bit. I mean, I guess it might have been like a ripple effect from that, but I don't know. I think, so that also, like the whole living museum, we can also talk about that in relation to skeuomorphs, I
The
think.
colonial revival was a slow evolving beast. I mean, when it came out of the centennial, and even by the 20s and 30s, you had huge amounts of furniture being designed for these quasi-colonial interiors and these bogus Georgian houses that were being built.
But the bars move now, right, John? Because I don't see a lot of houses in that period anymore. I mean, I think, like, so that's, you know, where are we at now, and what is that? You know, we were talking about singularity also on the phone, and how, you know, how are computers, here's another little provocative nugget, we'll go from Duchamp into singularity, but like, you know, how are computers going to make it okay for us to listen to them so they can control us in like several hundred years? If you know, if you buy into the singularity argument where, you know, AI is essentially going to take over and we're going to become essentially slaves in the larger future societies. And what triggers and what hooks are they going to use that's going to make us okay, you know, that we're going to follow along with whatever that programming is.
I don't know.
So
I had we had
skeuomorphs are important, I think.
absolutely, and we had a
Yeah.
conversation a couple weeks ago on the phone just to get our head together for today. And Beth was mentioning, and this has been something I've been thinking about since then, about what connections there might be between skeuomorphs and anthropomorphs. You know, how both kind of register a human presence or a human past or a human experience of some kind. And I think that as we're thinking about issues like artificial intelligence, like preserving the humanity of a non-human form, I think is something that's really interesting to think through. I've been thinking a lot about you mentioning that.
But isn't that with AI, that the uncanny valley?
The uncanny valley,
Where it freaks
yeah.
people out if it's too human? Because
Right.
it's that disconnect to allow it to exist.
Right,
Yeah.
right. So in some ways, the humanity of the non-human is a problem. It provokes its own anxiety of the uncanny. Yeah.
Huge. It's
Yeah.
like a major problem right now.
Yeah.
They have so much of the technology there, but it's just, yeah, for whatever reason it freaks us out. Maybe we know it's the end of us or something.
Right, right.
Even
Yeah.
automatons, if you look at that whole history, I mean, that is like truly uncanny. You know, it predates technology in some ways.
And, you know, so it's like the way that you talked about skeuomorphs was this like something that as a maker I was like completely could understand, and then the way you talked about them is the way that, you know, it starts to get into these larger things. But I wanted to just mention like blacksmithing. There's this practice of adding extra hammer marks so that people understand it was handmade, and it's horrible. But it's something that you do, you know, and it's probably something that blacksmiths back in the day wouldn't do, of course, because that's like extra labor that they don't need to do. So it's not efficient to randomly mark up the material to show that it's been worked, because it's been worked.
Right.
So there's no need to prove it. But now a lot of blacksmiths have to prove that because so many things are manufactured, they have to prove that it's been handmade in a way that people understand, which is this. They're basically faking this texture to make it more forged.
That kind of intentional, I don't want to say defect, but a kind of mark of labor of the tool of encounter. It's sort of like an Instagram filter, right? It's sort of, I mean, it's an analog nostalgia, this nostalgia for, you know, we must see the kind of evidence of human imperfection in order to feel that something is real.
And just the anxiety that's been brought up that this can induce in people. I worked with somebody who was a thinker. Like you know, not everybody thinks about this stuff, but he was thinking about it and like recognizing if he didn't put those marks, that he was changing the way people would see his work, but then recognizing that those marks were false marks that didn't need to be there. And he would just get into this cycle of just like what to do, as a person who's making this feel that expect it now. You know?
So that's interesting, though. I'm sorry, just to like this idea of the false mark. Isn't it just a mark? It's a mark. You're choosing to do it, I mean, I guess it's about the implication of whether you're going to deceive someone or not. Is that where the intention is there? Like if it's a mark,
It's about you're betraying your craftspersonship because you're putting in these craft marks that.
but are they crap marks? That's what I mean. I don't I mean,
as
I
an
get it.
example,
I get it. I don't. It's not that I don't understand it. I just think it's an interesting way of defining a mark in your mind.
Right.
Like this is a shit mark, and I'm putting it on my piece instead of like, I like the gesture of this mark and the history of this mark, and I'm putting it on the piece. Like I think it's an interesting way of
I think it depends on who's doing it and why.
judging your practice in some ways. So
Yeah, so,
yeah.
one of the reasons I was thinking about it is I worked at shops where they literally would have equipment made to create these marks that they would then sell to other people who would then use them in their work. So it's just the strange thing, and there's the stray mark, that is like part of the piece, that is like an accidental mark that maybe wasn't intended but it doesn't ruin the piece. And then there's the marks that are part of the piece intentionally. So I think it just kind of depends on how they're used. But in blasphemy, like the practice of like adding marks to the piece as a way to convey to the viewer that this has been forged is, it's just ingrained in the current culture of blasphemy.
Interesting. I have to bring up jeans. I'm so perplexed by the pre-worn, like really expensive. I'm panning for gold in these jeans, I've been through hell, and here I am in like $200 jeans. It just blows my mind.
Yeah. It's the same. It's a camouflage. Also, I think it relates to camouflage or razzle dazzle, like that whole history.
But I think it's talking
it's
about the
interesting.
physicality that we fear we're losing because of technology.
Right.
That I've worked, like I use my hands to do something or my butt, or I don't know how they get those marks on those jeans. Like I don't know what mark they're using.
Yeah.
Sander.
Yeah.
But ultimately, we're rejecting labor also. I mean, if you look at even the contemporary art world and how everything is so, I mean, I'm just like, not even as an argument, but just so ironic that everything is so heavily academic right now. And like this, I mean, there is a return to making or process, but I mean, please jump in here. This is just my opinion, but I just think it's ironic. It's like, these.
But don't you sort of buy it that there's a sort of democratic groundswelling of people that want to make stuff?
I think it's always been there, but I think whether or not it's been accepted generally for decades now in the contemporary art world is like, it's still kind of fringe a little bit. Like it's only kind of when this one artist does it or that one artist, but it's not really, it's not championing making.
No,
Never,
I'm talking about
I don't
something
think.
broader. Like when I go to houses from the 20s and 40s, in the basement there's a workshop. It was somebody's workshop. Like some guy was down there making stuff.
Yeah.
And I don't see that in houses now, but I feel like maybe in houses of these, I don't know, these people on Etsy or whatever, when they build their houses, maybe they'll have a workshop in the basement, you know?
Yeah, I don't know if you guys know the 1980s book, No Place of Grace by T.J. Jackson Lears about, in part, craftsmanship. And he was saying that the kind of craftsman ideal embodied in the arts and crafts movement, people, this idea that you're going to reclaim authentic labor through kind of modeling yourself after this medieval artisan, that the sort of legacy of that, in his argument anyway, are these basement workshops and these garage workshops that in fact it didn't actually change the form of our labor and the way that we made our living. It just enriched our leisure time, and it taught us that
It enriches your life.
it enriches your life, yeah. But there's a difference between labor that you do for money and labor that you do, although if you do it for Etsy,
So one of the modern equivalents of the basement workshop is the 3D printer and making YouTube videos. So people are making in lots of new ways that aren't recognized as a type of craft.
And there's that constant kind of joke, I'm making jewelry now, there's the Portlandia one, there's another one where the doctor comes out and is like telling the parents, like, I'm sorry to tell you, but your daughter's making jewelry now. It's like a disease, and now you have to like figure out what to do with this output that she's going to do and expect you to love and expect you to wear, right? So I think people are making it, but in different ways, and there's like tech shops and things like that coming up, tech shops,
Yeah, communal thing.
yeah, and there's like maker spaces and maker fairs and things, and I think like the move towards digital is making some people really long for handness, whatever that is. And so there's movements in that way, but it's just different though. I recently cleaned out a basement in a house from the 40s, and they had, obviously they've done, the labor that they performed on their vehicles in their house and stuff was done by somebody, and they had all these tools and all this like stuff. It was just, people just call people now for those skilled things.
Well, I think for a lot of people too, though, there's some anxiety around something being handmade. I can say that my middle class family in the Northeast, if they receive something handmade, there's like sort of this touch and go sense from them because they think that manufactured is better, it's more reliable. You know what you're getting.
Something that will expire in a year.
Right.
Those kind of, yeah.
I mean, I feel like I feel like probably everyone believes this, but to reduce making to labor, I have a problem with. Actually, I think about the idea of process and how a mark is a drawing, that can be, that has creative potential too. And I feel like we probably all believe that, but I feel like the way we're talking about it is as labor.
Yeah, that's really helpful. Yeah.
Although it is labor also.
Yeah, but I think about the labor of making a drawing then, to characterize it, I don't think about it in the same way necessarily.
It's like something else too.
Like there's a creative practice
Right,
embedded in
right.
that. It's different.
There's a kind of affective value.
Making a drawing, it's still making.
And I'm saying making a drawing in, like, on the surface of steel. I just wonder about the critical potential of shifting the language of that a little bit.
I mean, we looked at one example, right, but to continue that train of thought, the marks on steel, right, they're not functional, they're decorative. And things like marks on manufactured spun vessels, right, like handle marks are added to make it look like it's handmade, but it's not handmade at all. Then to take it to, Meyer or English Gray in the 90s fabricating handle marks.
Minus marks.
Right, minus marks, yeah.
And even, when there's something is manufactured, like, it can still, I'm trying to think of something that it can be handmade and look manufactured, like, there's just so many complicated ways of seeing these things. Because the hammer marks I'm talking about is to prove that it is handmade, and you're talking about something different. Yeah, so it's really, that mark can be so many things.
Well, someone creating a YouTube video could create something that looks very, I would say professional, right? It would look very polished. It would look very, not necessarily, it wouldn't have those marks of imperfection.
Except now there's a backlash against being too highly produced. And now the internet gurus are advising everyone to just use your iPhone. Just don't try too hard. Make it look really authentic.
Interesting.
Make it
Interesting.
authentic.
Yeah, make it, yeah.
Tangerine.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, so tangerine in and of itself would be a skeuomorph. It's filmed solely with an iPhone. Yeah.
But I'm curious about, so we're talking about, stylistic revivals or actual, functional pieces of furniture.
Yeah.
Most of your examples, Beth, were from fine art, except for your work and Maya's work. I'm curious about how you think about this notion of skeuomorph within an applied field. And I really like what came up with in terms of, we teach all these antiquated processes, so that necessitates us thinking about the original function of or use value of the specific formats we're referencing, and kind of cultural and social functions of all of the objects we could possibly engage. That does not preclude the existence of totally useless objects within the field, right?
Yeah.
And so, I guess what that makes me think about, and what I would argue is that for something to actually successfully function as skeuomorph, it has to make some reference to the original use value or engage the cultural social function of that specific format in order for it to resonate in any kind of way. I mean, just thinking about that, like the 90s teapots had nothing to do with the act of drinking tea or pouring water or, any cultural or social use.
I actually think they only were about consumption. They were just about collectors.
Well, are you talking? Can we clarify? Are you talking about an art teapot? Is that what you're?
Yeah. There's something.
But it is inherently a skeuomorph just because it is a teapot and it holds that history of that function, right? Does it have to actually function?
I don't. If that object doesn't think through that original function or through its original use value or cultural social functions, it just sort of falls flat.
Well, it's a reference. It's always referencing the whole history and the culture, in my opinion. I don't know what everyone else. I mean, I don't think that's. Yeah, I mean, I don't think just because it doesn't function per se that it's not. Am I understanding what you're saying correctly?
It's not a critically interesting object.
And I'm like, what is
Well, in some ways, though, that like thinking about an object that's not created to have use value, that kind of gets us out of the Marxist loop of thinking of everything as about either labor or use or utility. And like, in some ways, that could open a kind of playfulness for some other critical conversation apart from labor and use. Just to get back to your point earlier, possibly. I mean, the teacup and fur. That's such a playful, surrealist, exciting. It just sort of rejects that utility altogether. It like takes us out of that circuit of labor and use and value and being, you know, just little capitalist minions, right? It doesn't even let us get into that space.
I think it's also.
The reason why it works
Oh, yeah.
is because, you know, we all understand the experience of bringing up materials and drinking out of it.
That's
right?
true. It's sort of a sensory
It considers
experience.
its original
Yeah.
use value, or
Yeah.
its original use.
Yeah.
So are you talking about like the object that is so far removed from even being referential to what it is, but then there's like a hidden spout and handle kind of thing? Is that what you're talking about? Like, I think as long as there's like a spout, a handle, you know, like these very like key symbolic, you know, things that you find in that functional object, that it brings you to that place of dialogue. Whether or not you like the object is another question entirely. But if you're provoked, or maybe it's even the title, like, this is a teapot, this is not a pipe. You know, I mean, I think that these are all, I do think it is, I do think it does fall in this definition. I personally do.
But I wonder if you're engaged by all of those. I wonder, you know, I feel like what Yev's trying to do is sort. Like I'm thinking about the American craft in the 90s and teapots that were, you know, just vehicles to look like nature, natural forms. You know, that they weren't really engaging the idea of a teapot. It's just because someone was coming from that discipline and they felt comfortable with that form to make paintings of whatever, you know.
But
so,
this goes back all the way. I mean, you look at the collection here at the Chipstone, and there's fossilized teapots and vessels downstairs. This kind of mimesis or referential thing has happened for the entire history of decorative arts. So I think it comes down to an aesthetic issue in some ways, like what makes that valid downstairs, those invaluable objects that are also, you know, cueing you in by traditional forms. And something from the 90s that is, you know, I don't really see the dialogue being that different in some ways, besides a perceived value of what's better, what's not good aesthetically, you know.
I guess my point is just one resonates, one doesn't. I'm thinking about your piece, the really tiny little piece in the function, which is this just mass, decorative mass, but it's made up of broken functional objects, right? And so, because you recognize, because it's so distinctly decorative, but you recognize the parts that comprise it as distinctly utilitarian at some point, it makes you think about the original function of those objects and not just their utility. So for me, that object resonates specifically because you're thinking through utility and function, not because you're using you know, a goblet as a form to paint on.
Right. So the word resonate is such a, for me, in understanding and trying to understand what you're saying, like this idea that some pieces, you know, some objects, for whatever reason they're created, the maker has all these ideas, or the artist has all these ideas and thoughts, and they put these ideas and thoughts, academic discourse, history, they kind of layer it on, but somehow it like falls flat, like the music, you know, like there's different sounds and stuff, and for whatever reason, some things just don't work, but it has all this possibilities of working, all this intellectualizing or looking at it from all these different angles, but somehow it just doesn't resonate, it doesn't actually touch those chords that it's trying to reach out to. And I don't know if that, you know, where that's coming from a personal point of like, you know, what you feel, or if it's coming from it actually trying to, like this, the string that's reaching from this object that got painted a goblet to the history of goblets, or the history of a function or whatever, like that they're not tuned, so it's just like, it's just not making the right noise in your brain. And that's one of those things that's so hard to understand, you know, when a piece works and when it doesn't work, it's so arbitrary, and there's so many factors that go into it. But I do feel like lots of work, people just layer on all this meaning, sometimes after the fact, that they just, somehow it just doesn't work, and I don't know if that's what you're talking about. Yes.
Yes.
I do think also, though, if you look at like that period of time in the craft art movement, if we call it that. Like, that really worked at that time for those people because everyone was doing it. Right? Like, it was really popular. Now, I didn't necessarily like it then. I don't necessarily like it now. But, like, I think also what we're talking about is this scale that keeps moving. This scale of what's okay and what's not okay keeps moving. Like, at one point, that was a wildly popular way of working. Like, hordes of artists worked like that, And now it's not what's resonating for the general population or for the informed.
And that's where, like, art historical view of things, like, we'll look back and understand why, like, culturally, why was that happening in the 90s? Somebody was referencing the Soviet Union as a reason that something was happening, or the bicentennial with the furniture. Like, there's reasons things happen at certain times, and sometimes we're too close to see them, and so we don't understand them. And so that could be one of the reasons, which is, God bless critics and curators for knowing things and being able to see them into larger conversations, because sometimes as an artist, I don't really know them, those whatever things.
I would say it's the liberty of retreating into a discipline in the 90s, that's what allowed that conversation to happen in the way that it did. And now you can't make that work and exist within an art school if, if you're having to respond to all kinds of disciplines, that you're not just existing within the discipline and just having these formats that you're selecting from, you have to.
lazy.
Now we have other disciplines that we're expected to fit into, though. Now we have our own, like, you have to start with the idea and fabricate, for instance. That's what you need to do. You can't, or I'm not saying, this is provocative, I'm not saying I believe that, but that's one way, that's an acceptable way of working now in many institutions.
So now artists' jobs and thinkers' jobs is just like try at least to understand what they are being expected to do. It's not their job, but possibly, and then work against it. And that's how like the next thing will start, right? Like trying to move conversations in new directions by saying, wait, I don't want to make it in this thing that whatever it is that's forcing you, like the education or the marketplace or zeitgeist, trying to get you into a certain channel of making, and so then you can push against it, and that's where, like, nobody's gonna like your work in that moment. In the 90s, if you weren't, I don't know, like if you weren't painting on teapots, then nobody liked your work, but somebody in the 90s did something different and made work for the aughts. Right?
Isn't that like the exciting potential of being a practitioner now, though? Like I have students who never had landlines. Like, their phone has an old-timey ring, and they don't know what that means. Like, they're learning how to use their hands for the first time in my class, and they're also learning how to 3D print next to like learning how to solder. And so I think like the exciting potential for me in this conversation is like, what's next, and like how can we take what we know now forward as like educators and makers, right? And so instead of talking about like hiding a spout in the 90s, or like making floral forms, like how are we going to use like visual vocabulary and like the language of a handle or a spout, and like the mark of 3D printing, because we all understand that. Like, how are new marks and old vocabulary going to come together, especially now that people don't know, like my students don't know what like a corded phone is, or like a rotary phone, or like I don't know. I think
and frankly,
there's more potential in this than we're giving it, and we're talking about.
That's exactly right. But in addition to those things, right, everything you said, it's useful to think about use and function, because unless you do it to Mr. Opportunity, right, like those are the things we have to build on.
Yeah, I guess I'm just saying, like, how can we take that forward? And so.
I don't know, I think there's there's so many tangents that this conversation just shatters into, but I think that it's also an interesting environmental or sustainability conversation to be had here about skeuomorphs. I know that there is a corny Apple exec who, in the time in which Apple said they were moving away from skeuomorphism, said, this is better for the cows, they don't need to produce all that digital leather, and we're not going to waste so many trees with all of that wood, which is entirely a kind of fictive way of talking about things. But I also think the idea of working in unsustainable materials and thinking about reproducing the look or feeling of them in more sustainable materials is really like possibly exciting and interesting in casting sort of making our skeuomorphs for the future, right? Or thinking about what material, like is oil itself a skeuomorph, or is there a way in which petroleum products could be? So that's just a kind of environmental dimension that I was interested in throwing out there.
I mean, we're living in a finite environment, so is the skeuomorph going to be something that will still allow us to make that palatable, with this understanding of, mythic wilderness that we have, that we actually don't have anymore. Maybe we're triggered with that so that we can take less.
Right. Like what are the ethics? Yeah.
To make, especially in America, where it's wrapped up in our entire psyche of the frontier, the boundless frontier.
Absolutely.
It like in terms, sorry. in terms of like sustainability and environmentalism, it makes me think of like vegetarian sausages.
Or vegan leather, right? Vegan leather. It looks like leather.
Okay, so how does this not trump Lloyd? Like where does trump Lloyd fit in?
But I think that it does fit. It's just, it's another aspect, that mimetic, that whole layer of the copy, mimesis. That's why I brought up camouflage before.
Right.
We need to have the hearth. We need to have the hearth.
I call it authentic simulation.
Yeah. Well, and did we talk about this on the film where there was like 4 main things that humans needed from like primordial ooze? Like we need a vista, we need the water, we need the hearth. Like what's the 4th thing? The community. It's like you have these like primal. Well, that was just you can quote me on that. No, I'm just kidding. Primordial ooze coming up. John told me to just go, so I went. But it's like these like really elemental things that we kind of unconsciously, communally strive for when we're looking for home, what we consider to be home or hearth, where we feel safe, and how those things are like, marketed to us now. Today, 2016, like the hearth, it's that, water, these are all the commercial art in hotels, water, or cave, like that kind, and how that translates to symbology that is kind of affecting us in ways that we're not necessarily aware of. Am I saying something wrong?
No, unfortunately,
I said the wrong thing. Oh yeah.
I shouldn't even
Boom.
mention that.
Ooh.
Boom.
Right.
Yeah.
I can't stop thinking as I'm hearing all of you talk about this and just how the narrative potential of objects to get into all of these different things and these comfortable stories. Objects can reference these comfortable stories where it's a comfortable narrative about someone actually making this for you, or a comfortable narrative of form that's very familiar. And I'm not sure if it's because you started to stop talking about Moby Dick, but I mean, these are stories. These are things that, Apple can tell us these stories, the hotels can tell us these stories, and somehow the ability of things to prompt different kinds of stories can be used as a tactic to manipulate us, can be used as something to make us more comfortable, can be used as something to help us get information out of things.
And I think that story, the story that is directly, it's directly connected to the skeuomorph, because it's the object which inherently has something that you're recognizing, that you're attaching the story to.
And does the object then have some sort of agency that acts on you because it's giving you information? No, it's not mediated.
I
don't know.
I had a student a couple of years ago at a workshop at Oxbow, and from SAIC, and he was so great. He was just a young painter, and he was taking a glass blowing class, and he was like, I'm making these cups, and I'm just going to divorce them from the entire history of cups, because I said they're divorced. And I was like, I was, all right, I'll do, but I was, that like, I can still remember that. I don't really remember much, but I remember that, this like bravado of like, it's not attached to that history because I say it's not. Very much like Duchamp, actually, in some ways. So, I think I think it's a fallacy. I do. I was like, I'm good for you. You know, but good luck with that, you know, because I'm already like knee deep in what you're doing in a different way that you're anticipating. But we need that narrative. We need the hook. I think a lot of times. I don't know.
But that story is always fictive, right? It's always made up. I mean, so there's a way in which the sort of story we tell ourselves about authenticity is a story that we tell ourselves. It's not some access to an actual past, right?
Exactly.
And sometimes that comfort that a skeuomorphic object might be able to give you flips right over into discomfort with the, you know, the problem of the uncanny or the kind of horror of the teacup and fur, you know, or being called to think about a material that is unsustainable or unethically produced. So I think there is a lot of opportunity and potential in that storytelling that comes from objects, but it's also that could split off into discomfort just as easily as comfort.
And ambivalence.
And ambivalence, yeah, because it's always fictive.
Which is part of why it's so fascinating. Because there's so many, even if we pretend, people became interested in early American things because of the bicentennial. Well, that's this fantastic fiction that still impacts the House Museum that we're in today.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right.
So we probably have time for a few more questions before we head out.
I just got really interested in that notion of nostalgia and skeuomorphs not necessarily being authentic, but in their recreation of something that we feel comfortable with, they are a reflection of our perception of that thing. So, right, exactly. So since it's not the authentic real thing that's being reproduced in this thing, it's an embodiment of the way that we understand and perceive that thing.
Yeah, and I think that's built into the ambiguity of the word nostalgia too.
Right.
The definition of nostalgia that I like to follow is created by this Slavic literature professor, Svetlana Boym. She wrote this beautiful book called The Future of Nostalgia, which is just wonderful. But she talks about nostalgia as a kind of yearning for an imagined past, or a home that you had or didn't have, or this thing that's always subject to your own imagination. Yeah. Oh yeah, yeah, of course, yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
I feel like though in that particular case, though, the skeuomorph would be used to avoid nostalgia. Like thinking about, I remember when my father got his first car phone, and it looked like a phone. And our phones look like remote controls. You know what I mean? And similar, like an example I always show in my presentations is like the tea kettles that Joseph Barron's designed for the AAG, the first electric tea kettles, and they look like, I think around 1900, but they were hammered, they looked hammered, wicker handles, and they were giant electrical outlets coming out of them. You know, again, like ease the consumer into this new technology. So in a sense, to avoid nostalgia, I suppose.
Right.
To dupe you into it.
Yeah. Or to trigger your nostalgia to get you to give up the thing that you.
Right.
Yeah.
The training wheels of
The training wheels.
Now, were you talking about the phone on the phone call? We had the phone. You were saying that it was anthropomorphic, so people would not be so terrified of using it.
Oh, that's right. Yeah, there's a really good article that you guys might be aware of about when the phone was first made and how terrified people were of the phone when it went into their house, and then and how they tried to kind of ease that by the first phones having a face, having a mouth that you would talk into.
It makes it more terrifying.
And then, so we were talking about that, about anthropomorphized objects is also supposed to be comforting, but I loved what we talked about beforehand when we're saying that anthropomorphic objects can be creepy, or if they're anthropomorphic, then does it re-emphasize their objectness because you're trying to animate them? So if you're trying to animate something, then
it's always other.
it's an object. It's fascinating that the new technology, talking about the Apple and how they were trying to make it recognizable surfaces and things and textures and stuff, and how much user interface is its own field of study now.
Yeah.
So that people can make these objects, because we all laughed at this idea of a phone having a face, but all of our objects are equally as, will be seen equally as ridiculous. In a few years, when they look back at the weird things people are doing to make the user interface intuitive to us, so that we get so used to it and we learn and we just dive in. Like Apple is like master of this, right? The feel of the phone, your hand, the size of the phone, the weight of the phone, and all that stuff is considered. Because if it gets too small or too insignificant or it's embedded in our flesh, then we're going to freak out right now, but not in not in a short period of time. You know?
It is a short period, though. I mean, that goes to AI. I mean, the skeuomorph is now the computer, and we are the obsolete. Google cars. I mean, I know it sounds crazy, but start reading about singularity. I mean, there's some very. I'm not completely sold on it myself, but I think that the potential there. I mean, my uncle is a scientist and works. Putting all the microchips in every smartphone in the world, and he was like, it already exists. There's computers out there that we have no idea how they're doing what they're doing. They're intelligent enough that they're creating things, and humans don't know how they are doing what they're doing. So if we're already there, then this understanding of the fact that we can be replaced, and it, is kind of an interest.
Right? Like,
I know, right? We're so messy. I mean, I'm not obsessed with this, but I just think it's applicable to this particular definition. Like,
Reading sci-fi is so fascinating, because people considering these ideas years ago, and now they're happening, and sometimes I'm like, are we creating our own future by like imagining these things? Or is it inevitable that this is how technology would have gone if we hadn't already said that eyes should be scanned and fingerprints should open bank accounts and things like that, and all the other more super scary things that are happening to us. Again, they won't be scary in a minute, but it's fascinating to read these ideas. 50 years ago were already written down. Now they're coming into existence.
yeah,
And what kind of future did we foreclose by writing those stories 50 years ago?
Right.
What kind of,
right.
Yeah, like our own. This is the right word. Like we're our own necromancers. Like we're casting our own nightmares.
But I feel like as long as the field of ethics exists, like the question of the cars that drive themselves and they don't know if they're reading a stroller or a shopping cart, and they have to make that decision, and empathy is not built into technology. So as long as that question is there, then I feel like that's the bumper, that's the thing that slows down that conversation. But,
I gotta say, I
like
San
that.
Francisco, there's like a general, like, it's constantly being complained about, is that the people coming up through these fields of study have less and less compassion and empathy, because they're so tech-oriented that they've forgotten how to
Fascinating.
interact with these things. So that is also starting to crumble. You're right, it is the
so we're gonna
thing.
Empathy, obsolete.
Manufactured empathy is a skeuomorph. Manufactured empathy is a skeuomorph.
How do we program that in? How do you build in? Yeah.
I know.
Yeah,
You care?
Yeah.
I'll do whatever you want.
Yeah.
Right. Taser. It's like, that's
I
right.
love how the conversation broke down. So much of empathy.
I know.
It's like there's no more empathy. Mayhem.
I know.